Hello and welcome to Rock Your Block. I'm your host, Tia Young. Today we are continuing a special series, part 2, on the survival of the vanishing black farmer, history, testimonials, and solutions. In parts 1 and 2, we are examining the history. If you missed part 1, go to the Tijuana Young YouTube channel and watch the first series. Our first guest is a native of Montrose, Virginia, where he grew up on a family farm. He is a retired USDA official with over 37 years of service to the Department of Agriculture. He has also served as advisor to the Secretary of Agriculture, Director of the Office of Civil Rights at National Headquarters, Director of Conservation Operations Division in the Natural Resources Conservation Services, also known as NRCS, and he has also served as legislative assistant to Senator Tom Harkin, where he drafted a bill to stabilize land prices. Our second guest spent 38 years within USDA, 26 of those years working directly with farmers in the field, and 12 years as a senior executive professional. His work on the Civil Rights Action Team report, known as a CRAT report, opened his eyes to the challenges and injustices faced by African American farmers during the 1994 hearings across the nation. Ladies and gentlemen, please meet our returning guests today, Mr. Lloyd E. Wright and Mr. Richard Rick Swenson. Hello, gentlemen. How are you today?
Hi. Very fine.
Very good. Okay, so Lloyd, I'm going to start with you. I know that you took us through a report entitled "The Decline of Black Farmers in America." Can you go over that report again a little bit, just for those who may have missed the first series?
Okay. Yes. The Decline of Black Farmers report was really a report from the Commission on Civil Rights that was published in 1982. And that report, they highlighted the steep decline of black farmers. At one time in this country, 1920, there were about 925,000 black farms. Today, there's something in the area of 34,000 farms.
Is that declining?
Yeah, they've declined from 120,000 down to about 34,000, depending on how you count them. And which is about a 97% decline.
Yeah.
Now, the number of farms have declined overall in that, with technology, you can farm a lot more land. Whereas white farmers may have declined from 6 million down to 2, black farmers are down from almost 1 million to 33 to 37. Principal farmers, you're more like 33, and other farmers who are not principal farmers, if you include them, it would be a higher number.
When you say principal farmers and other farmers, can you break that down a little bit?
A principal farmer would be the lead person on a farm.
Oh, okay.
The manager operating the farm.
Okay.
There may be other people working on that same farm.
Okay.
They would be farmers, but not the principal farmer.
Okay, gotcha.
So first of all, it talked about the decline. And second, it came up with other findings and recommendations. Findings dealing more with the history of how the decline got to be as steep as they found it to be. And then they made some recommendations that would maybe stop the decline. But some of the kind of things they pointed out, and they really went back to the Civil War, they pointed out that where blacks were promised and expected to get land, and they talk about 40 acres and a mule.
Yes,
they got neither.
Okay.
Most of them left with the shirt on their backs. But during the next 25 or 30 years, many of them went into farming, in that then you could farm probably own but the many acres you could farm, because they didn't have modern equipment.
Okay.
So between the Civil War and 1910, we almost had a million black farmers. Large families, they could farm the land. But starting by 1920 and 30s, we had some equipment, and the farmers could farm a lot more land, but you needed to buy the equipment and you needed loans. So they started off with the fact that blacks just couldn't get loans to buy the equipment and expand. Programs designed to ensure that disasters did not put farmers out, whether it's the boll weevil with cotton or low prices or other kinds of floods, infestations. The Department of Agriculture always created programs to ensure that agriculture didn't fail altogether. Whites received the services and funds, blacks did not. So at the end of most of those disasters, white farmers had money in their hands, some, and black farmers had debt because they didn't get those services. And it didn't take very long for further decline. And one of the problems was that, being a large country, it makes sense to some people that you have local control of decision making. That did not work for blacks, in that 100% of the makeup of the local county committees happened to be white. And during the period of time when most of the farms were
now,
lost.
the county committees, is that like the governing bodies?
Yes.
Well,
at one time they were almost like the governing body.
Okay.
But now they have less authority, but they still hire the county exec who makes the decision. And they are federal employees, actually, but they elected. And that committee at one time made major decisions in terms of who got funds and who didn't. And this was happening back at a time where we had legal segregation in this country, prior to the '64 Civil Rights Bill. So there were parts of towns blacks couldn't even go into, and they certainly were not going to get services and did not. And they pointed out in this report how systematically blacks had not received the services and therefore could not keep up with the technology and expansion necessary to have viable farms. And I think at the end of the report, they cited that, first of all, that the decline of black farmers was really, that USDA had the major responsibility for it in terms of how they created and implemented their programs. And that if USDA did not change how they provided services to black farmers, that at the end of the century there wouldn't be very many black farmers.
Wow.
And they were right in that we're still declining.
Still declining.
There's a few small farmers coming in with an acre or two, and you might call them farmers, but farmers producing commercial crops and really trying to make a living from farming, it's still on the decline.
It's still on the decline.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Lloyd, for that. Let's go to Rick now. Rick, you spent over 12 years on the ground with farmers, and you and Lloyd, you were both key generals in doing all that you could do to implement the Civil Rights Action Report of 1997.
Yes. Tell
Tell us about that Civil Rights Action Report and how it got started and who was involved, and was it localized here in the DMV, DC, Maryland, Virginia area, or was it a national effort?
Well, building on what Lloyd just discussed, some of the ways that black farms were declining were local government officials using the programs to set farmers up for failure so they could get control of black farmers' land. That's in a nutshell what
setting up
and
a failure?
that mechanism, and we can talk about that more when we get into county committees and the mechanisms like that. Lloyd referenced it too, but that type of thing started becoming visible, and back in about 94, 95, Secretary Glickman, Dan Glickman to his credit, brought in a fellow that Lloyd and I have known for many, many, many years, Mr. Pearlie Reed, to direct a process where there was a number of hearings around the country. It wasn't just localized to DC. There were hearings, there was a hearing here in DC, but there were hearings around the country where farmers could come and talk about some of the experiences that they had losing their land where some of the programs were actually used as a tool to do that. And I will say on a personal level that that's where I became educated. I came to the hearing, and I was in New York at the time, whereas my duty station was in New York, and I came down to this hearing here. And I listened to the testimony of farmers that had lost their land, where basically there were a number of different mechanisms that they talked about how this would happen, but basically they were set up for failure so that they would fail, and then the agencies would foreclose on them. And I was quite moved by that, and I have been committed ever since then to doing whatever I could to fix this problem.
Right. What about the size of a team? Was it a large team that?
Oh, there was they assembled a whole, once they got the testimony in, and they were trying to figure out what could be done. There was quite a team of people that were put together to look at various aspects. There's the Civil Rights Action Team report had there were over 100 recommendations, as I recall, Lloyd, that were intended to deal with this and bring equity back into American agriculture.
So we have a little less than a minute before the break, but if someone could just tell me quickly, out of those 101 recommendations, how many of them were enacted, or were they enacted?
Lloyd, I'll let you start with
and
that
I think
one.
officially it may have been 92 recommendations with sub ones. Major recommendation was 92, and then there were additional ones that got up to be over 100, so 101 might be correct. A process started to implement those recommendations. And it went on for about 3 or 4 years, and at the end of the administration, I don't know if most people could find the report. And therefore, very few of them recommendations were implemented. Why? Mr. Reed was there, and Secretary Glickman, they got implemented. But in the Nixon administration, most of that fell by the wayside. And just to summarize the kind of recommendations that was included in the CRAP report, they were similar to the findings and recommendations in the Commission on Civil Rights report.
That's really
What it really noted is that nothing had changed. There's been a number of reports. There was a 65 Commission on Civil Rights report prior to the 82 that came up with the same kinds of things.
Wow.
But they've basically been ignored. And I would say that the 65 report was ignored, the 82, and the 97 report. So the conditions still exist that existed at the time.
We're gonna pick up right there after the break, and we'll be right back after these important announcements, so don't touch that dial. Hello, you're watching Rock Your Block, and with our special guest today, Lloyd E. Wright and Rick Swenson. Our topic is on the survival of the vanishing black farmer, history, testimonials, and solutions. Today, we are continuing our discussion on part 2, the history. Now, Lloyd, you talked earlier at the top of the program, you talked about the civil rights report. I think that was in 1982.
Right.
And here we are in 1997. Would you say 1997?
Right.
And you've got this report, you've got these recommendations, somewhere between 92, 101 recommendations. And you're saying they both are saying the same thing with nothing changing?
Yes.
Okay.
Primarily.
All right.
I think the Commission on Civil Rights outlined in some level of detail the findings they had on the ground. The CRAP report based their findings on hearings that they had across the country with Black, Latino, not just black farmers, but to a large extent in this country, it's black farmers who had that level of discrimination. But their findings were about the same. Not much had changed from 82.
Right.
And if you go, a few things have changed now, but a lot of the conditions that led to the decline are still out there.
Right.
And black farmers are still declining.
Right, and that's what I want to get into, because I know that before you and Rick both touched upon the county committee structure, how that structure is, but it's complicated. And I'd like for you to go back over that again, both of you. Just, Lloyd, maybe you want to start out and then turn it over to Rick.
Well, the county committee structure has changed. At one time, and the county committee at that time, right now is FSA is
FSA,
the
yeah.
food service. Farm service agency is the one with the committee, but the farm credit people, which was Farmers Home Administration, also had a committee, and those committees at the local level reviewed applications and at that time made decisions based on the recommendations from the county exec in terms of Agricultural Stabilization Conservation Agency.
So the county committee would tell the farm services credit organization who to give loans to?
Well, they used to approve them at one point.
Okay.
I would say back in the 60s and prior to that time, recommendations came in, they reviewed them, see if they met all the conditions, and then decided who would get what. And they weighted in on what kind of yields you were approved for and how many acres you had, crop acre base, all the kinds of decisions that related to you receiving. At one time, the county committees made those decisions, and they were local folk elected locally. But since we had very few farms and were not actively involved, blacks didn't even get to vote for those people who were on those committees. And that's when the major damage was done. Now, they have less authority now in that the people who administer in the programs and who are federal employees have more authority, but the county committees are still there. They still hire the exec in the county. Okay. And if you can hire me or fire me, you're my boss still.
Right.
So they're still very present. And the local control might work very well when you're trying to administer a program and thousands of counties. But it didn't work well for blacks. It may have worked well for those, for the other groups, but not for blacks.
So was there a different litmus test, for lack of a better word right now, was there a different litmus test for the black farmers and
well,
white
technically
farmers?
not, but I think if there was a section of the Commission on Civil Rights report that said that the county committees approved services or loans or programs for what they call safe blacks. And
What's
those
a safe
were
black?
those were the blacks who, first of all, were not likely to do anything that they didn't want done,
Okay.
and were not likely to promote trying to get their fellow black services. They called them safe in that report. But they didn't, for most blacks, they didn't approve a thing.
Okay.
And then when they started to approve them, the loans for blacks were supervised loans that were supervised by the county exec. And so if you had a given amount of money approved for crops that year, and during the summer you got your beans were infested with worms or something, and you needed to spray, prior to spraying you have to get the approval of the county office manager.
Even though you had the money
Yes.
already?
Yeah, you couldn't move it. You had the money, but you couldn't move it without their signature. And when I was director of civil rights, I settled a couple cases where the county exec, aware that the person needed to spray immediately to control the worms, waited until the worms consumed the beans and then approved the loan, so approved the movement of the money. The guy bought the chemicals and sprayed, but he didn't have any beans. So at the end of the year, not only did he have another bill to pay, he couldn't pay the loan back.
Right.
And that's how they started, you know.
Right.
So again, as they pointed out in the commission report, that USDA is responsible for the decline.
Right.
In that there are a number of people who did very devious things out there. And then there were good people who stood around and said nothing as it was going on.
Right.
So the net effect was that blacks got the short end of the stick.
Right. Now, Rick said something earlier about set up to fail.
Yes.
You know, so it sounds like that's a little bit of maybe what you were talking about.
Oh,
Let's
absolutely.
move to Rick. Rick, what say you?
The only thing I would add is that folks that are watching this are probably wondering, how is it that we got to a system where federal money, how to spend federal money and how to assure equity got in the hands of locally elected people? The reason why that happened that way is that back in the 30s, when we had crash, land values and farmers used the value of their land to go to the bank or the government to borrow money to raise crops. And the value of that land declined over 75%. So now all of a sudden you had the entire food production system of the country was in jeopardy because there wasn't enough money to produce food.
Oh.
So obviously they had to pump money into the economy to do that. Well, to prop it up so that we could continue to have food security. So the first system they devised to do that was ruled unconstitutional because they were taxing processors, middlemen, for example, and redistributing that money to farmers. And there wasn't any local or state level decision making in that system. So the Supreme Court ruled that that was unconstitutional. And so in response to that, they devised a system where there was a local entity that made decisions with respect to how the money was distributed, and that local entity is the county committee. So, and as Lloyd said,
The Fox Garden Hen House.
Well, even in the books, if you read, it says that system was built on a notion of farmers giving money to farmers. Okay. Now, if you think about that, and you have a very local system where you have a discriminatory mindset, you can see how, if there was a bias toward one or against one group or another, and in this case we're talking about African American farmers, you can see how local people could conceivably use the very system that was intended to make sure that the country had food security could be used in individual circumstances for purposes that were less than honorable.
Right, right.
Yes.
Well, I want to move to another subject, and that is that of the land grant universities. I know that years ago there was an 1890 land grant universities for African American community, and then there was an 1862 land grant a set of universities for the white communities. Please tell me that today, this is February 1st,
Yes.
2016, that this system is not there anymore. There's not this double system, that there's one land grant university program.
I really couldn't tell you that because it wouldn't be true. We still have, let's see, there are 1890 land grant universities.
So those are the black, those are black
for blacks, the
universities.
1890.
Okay.
President Lincoln created the land grant system where the federal government provide money to each of the states to create a land grant school that teach primarily agriculture-related subjects. That's where the land grants came from. Okay. Blacks were not allowed. Let me back up a second. 95% of the black farmers exist in the southern states that had slavery. And so there are few scattered north and in other states, but 95% are in states that prior to the 64 Civil Rights Bill had legal segregation. You know, blacks couldn't ride on the front of the bus and drink out of the water fountain or eat into restaurants and whatever, and that was a legal system. So neither could they go to the white schools. So in 1890, they created these black land grant schools so that there'd be a school for blacks to go to get education in agriculture. And whereas they have changed, they still exist. and they really need to, in that there are some needs in the black community that are not being met. They are doing a great job, but they don't have the resources that you have at the larger schools. They don't have the endowments, and in some instances where the state reduced their funds, they have trouble even matching the federal grant.
Right.
But they do exist. In the past 6 months, the Department of Agriculture, based on the 2014 Farm Bill, started a policy center at Alcorn University in Mississippi.
Yeah.
And that center will do research around issues relating to social disadvantaged farmers.
That's good.
In all of the states that have 1890s. So hopefully they'll coordinate what's going on, probably further document the same kind of things that's been documented by a dozen other reports.
Yeah.
And the reason you can document them in the next report is because they didn't change anything to speak of. But that's in existence. And there's a need for the 1890s. So
Right.
it's not a bad thing. It was unfortunate they needed to be in existence to begin with, but they've served their purpose and they've done
it's turned out
relatively well.
Well,
Yes.
listen, I want to take this opportunity to thank you both for coming on these 2 sessions. I think that you've done an excellent job in laying the groundwork for part 3, which we're going to be talking about some of the actual cases. We'll be doing that coming up real soon. So I want to thank you both so much for coming. And hope you come back.
In my case, it's been my honor.
Thank you. We want to thank you for watching Rock Your Block, and we will see you next week. Bye-bye.